Hi, I'm Michael Wan, News Director for Radio Korea, and this is Culture Shock, where we talk about politics, economy, culture, and entertainment.
And thank you for joining us on Culture Shock. I'm the Content Director for Radio Korea. My name is Young Kim, and today we have a very special guest. Special, well, not really more special, but just as special, or if not a bit more interesting than some of our guests that we've had earlier.
Because on our news team, we write about this person, very high-level person a lot. Yeah. So, and when we report about like murder cases or those, we have to get public announcements from Los Angeles County District's office. And we have Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon here.
Good to see you guys, Michael.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, sir. Yeah, it's evening. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Mr. George Gascon. You've been a DA. We've also interviewed your Deputy District Attorney, Paul Suh. He dropped by every once in a while and said great things about you.
He's a good guy.
Yep.
Oh, you know him personally?
Yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay. So you're a Cuban immigrant, right?
I am.
Yeah. Can you talk about your life in Cuba first? Because many people don't know your background stories, so we would like to get into that.
So, I immigrated in the late 60s to the LA area. But, growing up in Cuba, my parents were strong anti-communists.
Mm-hmm. Anti-communist,
yeah. So I have one uncle that wound up going to prison for almost 2 decades. My father was, constantly being harassed by the local police for his being very outspoken.
You said your uncle was in prison for 2 decades, right?
Right. And so, when my family started to immigrate from Cuba in the late 50s, mid-50s actually, but my dad's side of the family was really running away from communism in the 60s and 70s. So for me, the early stages of my life in Cuba were really kind of mixed, living under, my parents being fearful of what could happen to them. They tried to leave Cuba unlawfully a couple of times by boat. That did not work out. And then finally in 67, we were able to immigrate. We came through the Freedom Flights, which were flights that were directly from Cuba to Miami. And then from Miami, we flew to LA immediately.
You were 13 years old.
I was 13, correct.
Do you know why your family chose Los Angeles, the West Coast, as opposed to Florida?
So it was, we already have family members here. So my grandmother was here. I had aunts here. The first wave of my family immigrating from Cuba was before communism, and it was to Providence in Rhode Island. And then in the early 60s, they moved to California looking for warmer and drier weather. So by the time we immigrated, they were here.
Okay, so I think that was a different time in America, when you talk about the 60s and the 70s. We immigrated in the late 90s, or late 80s, actually. So I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant. He also immigrated around that same time. Yeah. He's a first generation immigrant, right? And as a Cuban immigrating from back there, that was out of political persecution.
Right.
What was it like? What was the atmosphere and the environment like in Los Angeles for you? Do you remember anything about it?
Well, it was, obviously very different than it is today. The neighborhood that we moved into is called Carajay. Is very Latino today, but when we moved there were no Latino families. In fact, my family was probably the first or second Latino family moving into that neighborhood.
Oh, really?
By the time we got there were a few more, but they're still not what it is today. There was not the prevalence of instruction in schools for non-English speakers. So that was a struggle too. And just in general terms, it was a very different period than it is today.
Yeah, Cuba was a communist country, right? Is it more like a dictatorship country? Can you kind of
That's
talk
correct.
About your,
so Cuba became communist in 1959.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Cuban government before 1959 was not necessarily much better. It was a right-wing dictator, and then it went to a left-wing dictatorship. So
Castro made it completely changed.
Exactly. In fact, my father actually was pro-revolution before it became obvious to him that it was communism. So Cuba had a history of, dictatorships, one after the other, ever since the independence from Spain. And it culminated with the communist regime in 1959, which continues to be there today.
Uh-huh. And I heard that you went through some hardship here because of English. You were you had to learn English after 13 years old. Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, so when I went to school, I started in middle school, and there were very few students that spoke Spanish. The school that I went to, Southgate Middle School, there was no program for non-English speakers. So I was in school probably for almost 3 months before the teachers started to realize that I didn't understand, half of what was being said or more. And then I got transferred to Nimitz Middle School. But I was accused. Really, what kind of finally broke my ability to get transferred was a science teacher came up and started yelling and accused me of using drugs. Which I didn't.
You
fact,
didn't.
My parents were very, very strict. And there was a young girl sitting next to me who spoke Spanish. And I could see he was very agitated, meaning the teacher, yelling and screaming. I asked her, why is he yelling at me? And she says, well, he's accusing you of using LSD, which was a very prevalent drug at the time. And I said, why would he say that? He said, well, it says your homework is horrible and it looks like you're very distracted. And I said, would you please explain to him that I don't understand English? So
they thought that you did acid just because you didn't understand English.
Exactly. Huh? So she told him, and he was very apologetic, and I was immediately sent to the principal's office. And then as a result of that, I was transferred to Nimitz Middle School in Huntington Park. Okay. And they had a program at the time. It was called NES, which was the precursor to ESL programs. Which stood for non-English speaker.
Oh, okay.
And so that was sort of my evolution from, going into a different school.
You felt you were discriminated against back in the day?
Well, I later on for sure, I think in middle school it was still very, it was in flux. I went to Nimitz. There were a lot of kids like me in Nimitz. And then a year later I got transferred to high school. And again, I went to there was no program for non-English speakers, and my grades were continuing to drop in the areas that required proficiency of the language. I was doing well in math, did well in physical stuff, was doing very poorly in English and science and the areas that require understanding of the language. And frankly, the reason why I did well in math is because math in Cuba was the programs were
higher level.
So it's much easier.
I think almost every country is higher level math.
Especially Asia
America.
too.
So I was actually, doing math stuff that I had done 2 years previously or 3 years previously.
So you were flying there.
So yeah. So I mean, once I got to the point in high school where I started getting to algebra and stuff, then I started really struggling because I couldn't. So I eventually, I was told by a school counselor that I was too stupid to go to college, and that I really needed to think about different trades, and I really became more and more distant from school. And I was working at the time part-time at a supermarket, bagging groceries, and I sort of started to further myself away from school until I dropped out.
Okay, so we'll continue about how you drop back in, because obviously to be in this prominent position, you do have to have a certain level of education accomplishments, right? As you tell your story, I can relate to it completely, because when I immigrated here, they had no support system except for ESL that came later on in junior high, I believe. But when I first went, I was blamed for something I didn't do, and communication was a factor. So I just want to point out that you actually went through the system where you found inadequate conditions for someone like you who had immigrated, a political refugee who had immigrated and was going through school. You didn't get enough support at the time, and then you were deemed just dumb and not able to go to a college, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, 100%. And, frankly, what I found out throughout the years is that my case wasn't unique, right? That a lot of immigrant kids were experience similar, they had similar experiences, and unfortunately, I think that often, a lot of talent is wasted because people are sort of sort of thrown by the wayside.
Okay. So your Cuban parents, you said they were very conservative.
Very
strict,
conservative.
Strict. Were they both Republicans?
Well, they were both conservative politically, but also very strict at home.
They were Republicans?
They were, yeah. Well, the one of them...
And you started off as a Republican too, right?
I did. Well, listen, I tell people that political affiliation is like religion. Whatever your homes or your parents is usually where you start, and then as you grow out of it, you may or may not.
So what started your shift? Was it some of these experiences that you went through in school and some of the discrimination that you faced that kind of tilted your direction towards more of like a liberal or like I guess progressive policies?
Actually, it took much longer than that. I wound up going to the U.S. Army.
U.S.
That's
Army,
actually
yes.
where.
I was about to ask you, yeah.
I got my high school diploma. I started college in the U.S. Army. And still a very conservative path, right?
Yes.
And then I got out of it. I went into the police department. It really was much later. I was with the LAPD for about 28 years. And when I left as an assistant chief running operations for the LAPD, so I went through all the ranks of being a police officer.
Yes.
In fact, I was a sergeant during the 1992 insurrection. I worked around a lot of Korean grocers in the south side of town. So, I went through many iterations of this. When I went to, I became a chief of police in Mesa, Arizona. And when I was there, I began to face probably one of the most ugly environments, anti-immigrant environments that I've ever
in Arizona.
Right, yeah.
Arizona.
LA tends to be, there's racism in LA and there's anti-immigration movements, but we're an immigrant community.
More tolerance.
Much more tolerant, right? We have Koreans, we have, people from Latin America, people from China, it's more of a melting pot. So immigration is, institutionally accepted. Right,
sure.
Even if you have some corners that may have some xenophobics. When I was in Arizona, it was really a major inflection point where you had people, and quite frankly, most of them coming from the Republican, party.
Yeah. Back then,
extreme
right?
Yeah, back then in 2006, that they were espousing extreme anti-immigrant. Positions and a tremendous amount of hate and a lot of racism, and so much of it was connected to the Republican Party there that I just could not associate with that any longer, and that's really what caused my sort of leaving and becoming a Democrat.
So your time in Arizona really changed your shift.
Right.
Okay,
and that was after your Army, military, and all
Correct.
that stuff. I have a really quick question. This was after you were LAPD, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, I was the chief of police in Mesa, Arizona.
So you mentioned the LAPD and the '92 riots, which is really a huge moniker for Korean Americans, as in terms of race and history. Our history here in Los Angeles, the way our upper generations, they came and they opened businesses to do certain things, and it was really affected very bad
for the Korean community.
And I'm sure you're familiar with the rooftop Koreans, right?
I am very familiar.
Yeah. Many Second Amendment advocates, they proclaim that this was one of the greatest examples of modern history on why the Second Amendment works and why it's here in the first place. But what are your thoughts on this piece of history? I know you have tough gun control,
gun control
policies
advocate,
on there.
Right?
And,
Well, look, first of all, I think we can always find extreme examples of almost any argument, right? And, what occurred in 1992 obviously was a tragedy for every community, the Korean community, the African-American community, every community that was present in this, it suffered from this, right? I think that for, Korean immigrants that were, and I identify with this because, my parents being immigrants, people come in, they work endless hours a day trying to make a living, sort of becoming acclimated to the American system, sort of wanting to get into whatever the American dream is to them, right? And then all of a sudden you had this incident, and, the hard work of years, usually the entire family wealth was tied to these places, was going up in smoke.
Yeah.
Right. And at the same time, if you understand the journey for the African American community and how they got there, the exploitation, the racism that have been visited upon the community one generation after the other. And this was an inflection point, right?
The police were not protecting the Korean Americans. They felt that way.
Well, I think, I think absolutely the police was not protecting anybody, right? I think it was one of those breakdowns in policing all the way around. I think that, the police were paralyzed because so much of what had led to the problem was, police practices in South LA. And I think the police command at the time thought that the best thing was sort of back off, because the more activity that they engaged in, the more that they would raise the violence. Obviously, that proved to be not a good approach.
Yeah.
And then, Korean communities, often the business people were left to sort of protect their own business for the first 48 hours or so. Yeah. I think everything after that, obviously, but by that time, a lot of places went up in smoke, right? And I think it was one of those areas where you can see systemic failures over years and years all coming to roost and not serving any community, right? And to the point that you make about the Second Amendment, a lot of people may argue, well, but for some of those business people having their guns, their businesses would have been in worse shape. And undoubtedly, on a very micro level, at the individual, there were some cases like that. But the reality is that at the larger scale, when you look at it, there was a tremendous amount of crossfire. There was a lot of people who were put in danger. And I don't know that the Korean community that was there at the time was any more protected by having those guns, other than, maybe individual cases, right? So I think it's one of the things where, you can have either side can make arguments about, whether this is a good or bad thing. But I think really what this period to me speaks of was about tremendous systemic failure, right? Social, economic, and it all came together. And certainly the police was sort of the tipping point.
Well, I mean, because we had the appeal of, I believe, the Sun Jadu or Jadu Sun, that case over there with Latasha Harlins. Correct. That was exactly a week before, and then about a week after, they had the Rodney King verdict that came out. Right. So the African American community at the time was already, enraged over the decisions that were going on, and to add on to that, I think that just did come to the tipping point.
Yeah,
definitely, and I think it was a systematic failure, because Korean Americans, especially in that time, and even now, they depend on the police and they believe in the police force. They always had belief in the police force and in the point of authority that the police would save them. So I think that was a great disappointment to a lot of people out there. And for you to be in that situation and to watch this, I'm sure you've seen a lot of things that was happening in the police force as well, during your time. What were some of the difficulties that you faced while you were going up the ranks into the assistant chief, I believe, the position? I mean, what were some of the personal, I guess, problems or issues that you saw within the forces? I mean, you mentioned racism and you're of Cuban descent. There must have been a lot of discrimination on that part as well.
Well, I mean, starting with, my academy class, right? There were two Latinos, actually
only two back then.
One and a half. Myself was a fool, and then another was and there was one African American. There were no members of the AAPI community.
It was all white Caucasians. Right?
It was pretty much all white Caucasian. There was one woman. So it was a very different period in the LAPD, right? I mean, I don't recall really, for instance, members of the AAPI community in the police department until years later. Right? And very few African Americans. And a few Latinos, right? Very few women on the job. So the force was not an integrated force by any stretch of the imagination. That reflected in a lot of the internal environment of how people spoke about other people, especially how they spoke about Asian Americans, how they spoke about African Americans or Latino, or it was a culture that was dominated by extreme, biases and in some cases racism, but even on the best scenario, very extreme biases. and that reflected in the work that we did.
Mm-hmm.
And even communities, like you say, like the Korean community, which tends to be, by the way, the African American community tends to be very supportive of police too. When it comes to police funding, you see the activism on one side, but the reality is that every time that there was a bond fund to build police stations, right, South LA would always have some of the highest number of people voting in favor for it. But even, let's say, like, the Korean businessman and others that dealt very closely with the police, but there's still the attitude of the police towards that community was not necessarily in accepting.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah,
and
especially during those times. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, during those times more so than today. I mean, today obviously there are many Korean American officers. It's a more diverse.
Uh-huh. Did you always want to be a police officer? What motivated you to join the force?
No, so I went in the Army really by coincidence.
Okay.
I just realized that if I stay in my neighborhood after dropping out of school and stuff, I was not going to get anywhere, and I was very uncomfortable with that future because I looked at the kids around me, and most of them were ending up, getting hurt, going to jail. It was not a good environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that the Army was a way for me to break away from that. And it was in the Army really that, I started to sort of become more adjusted to a regiment of military style of life. And then when I got out of the Army, my intention was to teach, so I went to Cal State Long Beach to get my teaching credentials. I already had a couple of years in college that I got through the Army. And it was there that I met a friend of mine that had joined the police department. Oh. And that's kind of what piqued my interest and wound up getting me to where I wound up being in the police.
So it was more of a livelihood thing rather than, you
it
really
was very
wanted
much
to be
a livelihood.
force.
As a matter of fact, I was...
Fight for justice.
My wife at the time and I were thinking about starting a family. And we compared salaries of police officers and teachers. And interestingly enough, police officers made a lot more. They still do. Than teachers, which seems very, it doesn't seem to make sense to me today, but that's what it is.
You went through a tumultuous year of LAPD, right? Including the Rampart scandal, the infamous Rampart scandal, and you were in the middle of all that, right? Can you kind of touch upon that?
Yeah, so the first of all, we have the sort of the whole Rodney King incident, the insurrections, and sort of the Christopher Commission. And that report that, was extremely critical of the LAPD. And then you fast forward a few years later and we have the Rampart incident. By the time Rampart is discovered, I am a captain. I'm running the Harbor Division of the LAPD, which is sort of the San Pedro area. And part of the department's response to Rampart was, while you had internal affairs doing the investigation into the wrongdoing of the individual officers and working with the district attorney's office to prosecute officers who were involved in criminal activity, the department put together what they call a board of inquirers at the time, and it was under Bernard Parks, who was the chief of police.
Yes.
And I became one of the command staff officers working in that board of inquirers, and actually it was broken down into different parts. And the part that I was working with as a team, it was under a deputy chief, and our role was to look at supervisory and management failures. So part of our process, we interview, I was part of at least 30 or 40 interviews of sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, former Rampart supervisors present, really trying to assess what were the failures in leadership that allowed this to occur. And that led to a section of the report. And there were certain things that they made a tremendous impact on me. Just how when leaders fail to lead, really bad things happen. And it's just, looking at little things and ignoring them. And one thing is a little larger. And so I learned a great deal from that experience. And then shortly thereafter, I was promoted to the rank of captain, and commander, and I was put in charge of training for the entire department. By that time, now we're working with the U.S. Department of Justice on a consent decree. And a big component of that consent decree was how to revamp the entire training process of the police department to create more constitutional policing. So all of a sudden I got thrown into the process of working with many others, both inside and outside the police department, to create a whole different process for training people.
Oh. Did that experience kind of make you more critical of law enforcement, that so many corruptions are going on? And do you think it's still going on?
It absolutely did. And and when I said maybe critical is not perhaps I wouldn't say critical, but more more discerning, more skeptical, really looking for, trying to always understand, sort of behind the curtain what's going on. The majority of police officers, even under those really bad periods, were trying to do a good job under really bad conditions, right? A few don't. They go sideways for a variety of reasons, right? And I think understanding how that occurs and how people are sort of led into a bad place, it was something that I really learned and went through it, and it's created more skepticism when I look at not only, frankly, at the work of police officers, but I do the same thing with prosecutors too.
I think it really it's really important to hear something like this from the person, because when you hear about their personal experiences, then you kind of get more of an understanding of, why I understand why he wants to give these people another chance. I understand why you don't want a person to go through the jail system. I understand, because a person who's been caught on a minor charge, something that's not even a big deal, honestly, if they were actually put into jail and went through a year of it, the person would come out like not the same person. They would probably come out more willing to commit crimes or been around criminals a little bit more. And it's like, the one rotten apple that ruins a bunch. It's like the same thing if you're putting them in that kind of a position. I understand that kind of stuff. And I think from your experience, you want to give everyone a chance. But like when you're talking about, I think we're going to save like some of the tough questions for later on in the second half. But just to start, like I own a small business, right? But then because of I remember LA in the 80s and the 90s and stuff. And I left for about 20 years and I came back. And the LA that I see is a little bit different than the LA that I remember for some reason. It seems that, if someone's coming to my restaurant and having some food and they don't want to pay for it, they can just leave. And there's really not much I can do about it, And then although these are really small crimes, it's not that big of a deal. I could live without $50. It's not a big deal. But the thing is, it becomes a pattern and it happens all the time. And some of us, like small business owners, we feel helpless about like what we can do and our rights. So, I mean, how would you answer that kind of a situation?
First of all, you should not have a tolerance for anybody walking away without paying their meal.
You're right.
It's a theft. It's against the law, and there should be consequences to that. So the question is not, whether consequences should be there or not. They should be. The question is, what is the right level of consequences? Should the person, go to jail for that, which in some cases maybe they should? Should the person be diverted because they have mental health problems or substance abuse? Is this a chronic offender? Is this the first time this person did this? But, those are not the decisions that you as a businessman has to make, right? Your decision should be, this happens, you call the police comes in, and they make an arrest, right? And then we figure out what the right intervention is. I think that the problem that we see often is the perception, because it's being sometimes provided a picture by police and some that, well, there's nothing I can do because this is a low-level offense. The reality is that low-level offenses get treated today probably in many cases the same way they were treated years ago. I mean, I was a cop in 1978, 79, and if somebody walk in your restaurant and walk away with not paying the meal, we cited them and released them immediately, right? And if it was the first time, the DA was not going to file charges. And if it were multiple times, the DA might, right? So the consequences for that type of behavior today shouldn't be much different than they were in 1978, except for I think that today we have more capacity to understand that we should be looking what else is driving the behavior, right? Where in 1978, it was we either release you or we put you in jail, and if you go to jail, you're going to get released immediately anyway. There was no thinking about, is there mental health problems? Is there substance dependence? Are there diversion programs? Right? None of that stuff existed then. But I think that what we often see, and I hear this all the time, and frankly, it drives me crazy when I hear a business person or a resident say, well, I had this theft and I was told by the police, well, there's nothing I can do because it's under $950 or because the DA won't do anything. First of all, if you're in the city of LA, a misdemeanor would not be prosecuted by my office. It would be prosecuted by the city attorney. So the only truism to the statement that the officer makes, well, nothing the DA will do, that's right. I wouldn't, because I have no jurisdiction over a misdemeanor in the city of LA. But I don't think that the city attorney would be very happy if you tell her that the police are saying that she won't do anything about it, because that's not true. The question becomes, what is the right level of intervention? And sometimes the best intervention is just simply having the police arrive, make an arrest, and make sure that then the system takes.
Okay. Well, I actually have a question about that as well, but we're going to get to that right after this break.
Yeah, so we'll be back with Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon after these messages.
And George, I want you to watch this because he acts in this clip and he's actually pretty good.
Okay, good deal.
엘리베이터 내가 다 와놨어. 빨리 다치기 전에 빨리 빨리
진짜 아까 그 사람 찾으면 우리 늦었어.
그니까 진짜 엘리베이터 타서 너무 높아. 내가 진짜 밥 살게.
근데 나 요즘 속이 안 좋아가지고. 모르겠어.
왜 이래? 내가 도와줘줄까?
근데 면제 끝나고 뭐 맛있는 거 먹고
시작하라고.
소화제 먹고 맛있는 거 먹지 마. 어때? 조금 괜찮은 거 같기도 하고 잘 모르겠더라.
All right, we're back. So let me just tell you about this incident that I had. There was a rowdy customer who came in. He was being very difficult, so we had to call the police. The police came, and then in the end, all he had to do was get up and go. He didn't even pay for the food anyway. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time. So, all he had to do was leave, right? But he wouldn't leave. He was being really stubborn or something. And then the cops were like, "Okay, then we're gonna take you in." They took him in, right? And then an hour later, he came back. He was released. He came back.
Yeah.
Now, he wasn't a violent person. For sure. Okay. So thankfully, but had he been I think the waitresses they called me and they told me that he was back, after being taken in. I mean, and they called that a concern that he was going to do something in the restaurant. Now, obviously this guy has mental issues, obviously, I mean, unless he's just a rebel without a cause, but that kind of a situation, I mean, it could be a bit risky to let someone like that out, but I don't know. What's the answer to this?
I mean, obviously, I don't know the details in this case, but let me, sort of give you a hypothetical, right? I mean, somebody gets arrested for low-level misdemeanor if they can identify themselves, if they have no warrants, under the law, they get cited and released.
No
right?
warrant, okay.
So, but here's where I think is important, right? He should not be going back to the same business, right?
Yeah.
And if he does, I think you need to call the police, because then they can make a second arrest, and then this time they don't have to release him because he doesn't qualify for the cite and release anymore immediately because he is now repeating the same conduct. And one of the conditions of being cite and release is that you're not likely to continue the same conduct
This is so awesome. I have my own, like, personal deputy.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, not deputy,
personal
personal district attorney over here who's giving me advice on this. Thank you.
So this is by the LA Times report. This is a Korean American community incident that happened. I'll just read a short part of it, please, and then you can respond to this. So there was an individual named Dalgun Lee who was 70 years old. Right. And on May 5th last year, he was sitting in his work van outside his South Los Angeles laundromat when a man came up behind him and stabbed him in the neck, and he just died. And his daughter specifically blamed you, sir, for failing to keep hardworking Angelino safe, in the article. Now, less than a week before, prior to her dad being killed, a 20-year-old USC Chinese student was also stabbed by the same man. And he was arrested by the campus police, but he was released shortly after. And according to LAPD, detectives presented a case for felony assault with a deadly weapon against him, but your office rejected the filing. And instead they passed it on to attorney's office for misdemeanor consideration on May 4th, and Lee was killed the next day. Can you respond to this?
Yeah, and look, first of all, very tragic, right? The loss of a human being, that family person, somebody's worked all his life, clearly that was a loss. And I understand the anger that, the family felt over this case. But the reality is that the first incident was reviewed by our filing team. And it really had nothing to do with policies. It had to do with the law. There were no injuries in the first incident. In fact, no weapon was ever identified. He was not stabbed, as it was presented earlier.
The Times reported wrongly.
Well,
in this
no,
case.
that's what they reported what they were told, right? But we looked at the evidence, and it was determined that was misdemeanor conduct. There was a misdemeanor assault, right? There was no weapon identified, none of that. So a misdemeanor assault in the city of LA goes to the city attorney's office, right? So the filing team followed the law. And that case was presented to the city, back to the police to be presented to the city attorney. Unfortunately, and very tragically, this individual who had evidently a whole bunch of other problems went back within a few days and murdered Mr. Lee. And, he's facing the consequences of that right now. But it's important that we understand that an office like mine sees about 100,000 cases a year. And sometimes what the police present initially and what the evidence will tell and what we can prosecute a case for may be different things. And this is not under my administration. This has been going on for generations, and it will continue to go, especially because we don't handle misdemeanors. If we were the misdemeanor office as well, it would not have been referred. It would have simply been filed as a misdemeanor, and we do that in parts of the county where we are the misdemeanor attorneys as well. But, we are bound by the evidence and the law and what we can prove in front of a jury. And the initial incident did not rise to the level of a felony conduct.
Okay. So I don't, just as in the case that he mentioned, I think that's one of the things that's a concern, that some of these people that are being caught and released might have a deeper history of things that happen, and people with even violent criminal offenses in the past may be overlooked. Is California, or whether at the city level or the state level, are they looking into this like seriously to try to prevent more of these cases where people with a history of violent offenses gets screened through and then comes back out to commit some of these crimes?
Look, I mean, this is always the difficulty about this work, right? I mean, you have people that come through, get arrested by the police, and they may or may not have a criminal record, but they may have a history that is unknown to the police. The criminal record may or may not be relevant to the particular case that is being presented. There are many factors. And you're dealing in a system where you have human beings that are using, judgment in a very short period of time. And by that, I'm talking about not only the prosecutors, I'm talking the police, the prosecutors, everybody down the system, where you're reviewing cases very quickly. Mm-hmm. There's a large amount of work. And this is not unique to LA, by the way. This happens in every community around the country. Prosecutors are making hundreds of decisions daily, right? And the system is not perfect. And the reality is that we can look for ways to continue to tighten things up, but there's always going to be gaps. And this is not new. This has been going on forever, and it will continue to go on. Right? It's not a perfect system, and it's very hard to do things that will 100% guarantee an outcome of anything that we do.
George, I think you know that some have been criticizing you being soft on crime, right? I know that this is not the first time that you've been hearing this. So the LA County District Attorney's Office, a lot of insiders have been complaining, even to me, as a news person, I get all these information that you're too soft on crime, and they feel like you're eroding the trust to the public. I see a lot of Los Angelinos leaving the county because they feel unsafe doing business, even living here. And currently, I understand that there's 200 open positions in your office, and you have 10,000 backlogs open. I mean, 10,000 cases in backlog. So can you address this?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't know where the 10,000 number came up. I know that the union vice president has come up with that. He talked about it. There is no such thing as 10,000 backlog, okay? We handle about 100,000 cases a year, right? And there are cases going in and out regularly. We also came out of the COVID period where the courts were, built up a tremendous amount of backlog, not only for my office, but quite frankly, this happened around the country. And, we are working through this. We do not have 200 vacancies. During COVID, we lost a lot of positions. We have roughly about 100 vacancies, which is not uncommon for an office of our size. As a matter of fact, today we had an incoming class. We're recruiting people at a very good rate. The reality is that not only my office, but the police department, offices around the country are having a hard time recruiting because the job market has become extremely tight, and we're no different than anybody else. Interestingly enough, we're attracting a lot of people from neighboring district attorney's office that want to come to work with us to do the work the way we do it. Now, the concept that I'm soft on crime is so much driven by politics, and we see that not only in LA, but we see it in other parts of the country. When you compare our crime rates to other communities, especially communities where you have very conservative DAs, our crime rates are substantially lower. In fact, if you look at some of our neighboring counties, they have much higher rates of violence than we do. And if you look at our crime rates even today, right, year to date, we've had tremendous reductions in homicide. We're quickly approaching the pre-pandemic period in terms of the crime numbers. When you look at our filing rates, we file crimes at about the same rate as the prior administrations did when it comes to felony, when it comes to misdemeanors that involve violence or assault or theft. But it's not politically convenient for people to say those things because then it doesn't fit the narrative.
I think it was pretty high for a while, and then kind of recently it kind of dropped.
Well, it was very high for a while around the country. In fact, it was higher in counties like San Bernardino, Riverside. So even when it was high, we were lower per capita than most of the other communities around. We are the largest county in the country. We are larger than 42 states. We have over 10 million people here, and we are the largest office. So there is a lot of activity. But when you look at the per capita, you look at the ratio of crime per person, we continue to be much safer than many communities that are around us.
A lot of mom and pop shop owners, I'm talking about Korean American owners, they feel very unsafe because of the zero bail policy. You're a believer of zero bail, right, sir? So they don't get charged. They don't get charged, and they repeat. They steal up to $950, and it's not just $950 per day. It's per store, and they would just steal. You see these smash and grabs, and we never seen those kind of incidents before. This is like it happens in droves. So a lot of people feel unsafe the concept,
here. But I think let me stop you because we're conflating a bunch of things. Okay, right. So first of all, here's bail. Second is whether somebody's going to get arrested and charged, right? Okay. So if you go into a store and you steal $949,
$49, yeah,
it's a crime.
Yes.
You can be prosecuted. You can go to jail. You can be given up to 6 months or a year in jail. Okay, number one. So it's not a crime. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
but they just get out of jail. That's what the police have been saying.
They will get out of jail because our jails are full, because we don't have enough space in our jails, because we have people that are really committing a lot of violent crime that are taking the space. But let's go to the zero bail policy, because while it is true that I'm against cash bail, there's a difference between cash bail and releasing dangerous people. In fact, cash bail often allows dangerous people to be released because they can afford to pay bail. So, for instance, we had an individual that was doing follow home robberies multiple times, 4 times as a matter of fact. Collectively, he posted nearly $500,000 in bail, and he finally committed a murder. That's someone that should never have been released on bail, period. He should be detained because he's dangerous. Conversely, we have people that are not dangerous, but they cannot afford bail, and they stay in jail, occupying space. And that's why sometimes the people that need to stay in jail can, because there's not enough room. Now, what the no bail policy was, and I think it's really important to understand, this is a court-mandated process. First of all, bail is not set by the prosecutors. Bail in each of the 58 counties in the state is set by the Superior Court. Mm-hmm. Every year, the Superior Court decides how much cash bail is going to be attached to each individual crime. That is called the bail schedule, and that's given to police departments and jailers. And when you get arrested by the police department or the jailer will look at the offense that you got arrested for, and they determine what the bail should be, and if you can post the bail, you get released. Okay? During COVID, the Superior Court and all the Superior Courts in the state came to the conclusion that they needed to release people from jails because it was getting too dangerous to have overpopulation in the jails.
Probably we need more jails then, right?
Well, let me finish first, because it depends on how you look at it. I think we need more mental health facilities in that, but that's a separate question. But so what they did is they came up with a zero bail policy for misdemeanors and non-violent felonies. It did not apply to violent offenses. And during the time that the no bail process was put in place, actually, there was no discernible increases in people violating their release conditions. In fact, to the contrary, there is evidence that shows that actually, with the exception of you always get the extreme cases, the majority of the people were attending to the conditions of release.
Go ahead.
Bail set by the courts, and then the police release. The prosecutor usually don't get to see the case until weeks later. In fact, during COVID, people were being cited sometimes as far as 3 months down the road. We were not seeing those cases until a week before they were coming to court. Somebody committed a crime, they got arrested, they got released. Sometimes they committed a second crime, they got arrested, they got released. We were not seeing those cases. It has nothing to do with my policy or the belief that I have that cash bail should be eliminated. It should be a risk-based process. But again, it's important not to conflate the bail schedule or the bail policy with when someone commits a crime. And when they do, if they get arrested, they should face the consequences. And certainly somebody that goes into a store and commits a theft, they're committing an offense.
I know you emphasize on mental health a lot, right? And mental health. But do you know the Stephen Sutherland case? I think you know. In November 2000, Sutherland attempted to kill a construction worker by slashing his neck. Despite that attempted murder, your office instead charged him with assault. And despite charging him with assault, your office rejected the idea of giving him jail time, instead putting him a mental health diversion program. But he ended up killing somebody. Down the road.
Yeah, actually.
So what do you say to that?
Yeah, so a lot of incorrect information there. So let me begin by saying that this man was actually examined by court psychologists.
Poor psychologist?
Court
Okay.
Psychologist. He was examined by court psychologists by the courts, and he was determined to be eligible for mental health diversion. He was out for 2 years before he committed this crime. My office did not make the determination to release. The determination to release was based on the recommendations of psychologists by the court.
But you're saying that 2 years after he tried to slash a man's throat, no jail time, no parole, no real consequences. This is a wrong report, you're saying?
No. What I'm saying to you is that it's not that my office released him. What I'm saying to you is that there was a medical examination. The experts that are appointed by the court determined that this person was releasable. He was released. Okay. He was crime-free for 2 years and then committed this offense.
Are there any like repercussions for experts or court-appointed experts that make these kind of decisions if they're wrong, perhaps?
So let me ask you something. What happens when you go to the doctor and you have cancer, but they don't determine that you have cancer initially because they try to see your symptoms and see what other things are consistent with, right? None of this stuff is 100% for sure, right? Psychologists that are court appointed are very experienced people, but there's like any other doctor.
Okay.
You know?
So there are misses. You know, I have a question for you that we do have to get to. You mentioned you dealt with corruption that was going on in the Rampart division. You have experience doing that. There's been accusations, and I believe there's an ongoing trial of gangs in the LA Sheriff's Department. Banditos. What are your thoughts on gangs like that?
Well, look, I mean, it's completely unacceptable.
I mean, so they do exist, right?
Well, I believe that the evidence says that they are deputy gangs in the sheriff department. I think the current sheriff is aggressively working to deal with this. You know, the prior sheriff actually denied their existence.
Villanueva, right?
Even though there was tremendous amount of evidence to the contrary. This particular trial that you're talking about is a civil trial, if I understand the trial that you're speaking. And, you know, we look at each case, right, when it comes to us. And obviously we look for the evidence of criminal behavior when there are police involved, just like we do when other people are involved. But the reality is that when you have law enforcement involved in gang-like activity, you know, it's completely unacceptable. And if that influences criminal activity beyond the association with the gangs, then we play a role. I think that sometimes you have administrative measures that the sheriff department is trying to take, but this is clearly a big problem.
And you know, you have like around 20 cases of high-ranking members of your office who claim they were removed from their post because they openly criticized you. And you actually, I think your office lost the case against Sean Randolph. The jury agreed awarding her a $1.5 million verdict last month. Can you kind of talk about this case?
Yeah, well, so that case is under appellate process, right? I mean, there were there's a lot of inconsistencies, so I cannot talk about the case. But we have 35 head deputies, and this is a large office. Actually, under prior administrations, there were moves that included more people than what I moved. I moved initially 17 people. 15 of those were head deputies. They were not demoted. They continue to be head deputies. We simply move people around, and we will continue to do so. I think that when you have an office this large, you know, you got people retiring, new people getting promoted, new people being hired, and that constantly creates a trickle-down impact. And I think that the moves that we made were consistent with civil service. We don't make any move without, first of all, checking with the Department of Human Resources and with our county executive office, and those were all approved. This particular case, you know, we're in the process of appealing, and we'll continue to litigate these cases.
Okay, you mentioned Villanueva, and I know you guys, your offices have had like quite a conflict here and there. CCWs, on the subject of CCWs, there's less police force on the streets right now. I mean, call times are ranging from 20 to 30 minutes to call. If you call in, you know, it takes a while for them to get there. And CCWs are something that Villanueva wanted to provide to a lot of the Second Amendment community that believe it. Why does it feel like the state of California and city of Los Angeles like wants to keep guns or that kind of protection out of the hands of rifle gun owners or people who aren't, you know, breaking laws, you know?
Yeah, you know, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I think, first of all, you know, I'm not against responsible gun ownership, right? But I think that one of the things that has made a difference for California is the fact that we have very restrictive laws on the use of gun. And just today, for instance, there was a publication on the LA Times published that the number of gun deaths in California is substantially lower per capita than states that have very loose gun ownership laws. So there is no question that the reduction of guns and who can own a gun and how they can own a gun does impact the capacity to reduce gun violence. I think that the key to this is responsible ownership, right? And responsible ownership to me means that there's a thorough background check, that there's a cool-off period. So if you're angry and you go buy a gun, you don't immediately walk out with a gun. That you have to register that weapon, that you have to be trained to use that weapon, that you are not a prohibited possessor, that, if you have a history of violence or you have some other history, perhaps mental health, that you should not own a firearm. And I think that is a very reasonable approach to being able to have a gun. And I think that, we distinguish ourselves, I believe, because of those restrictions that we put in place.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
Well, my subject was on CCW, so I understand the background checks and all that. I agree with all that. The 10-day period, I agree with all that. But, we go through another background process to get a CCW or a concealed carry license. But even when we have those, I mean, you have Governor Gavin Newsom who's creating new laws to make those outlawed in all these different places where, in fact, basically you have no choice to carry anything, even if you do have a permit. So I just feel like that the government seems to not trust its own citizens who've gone through the background checks, who've done everything right, and is owning guns properly, and uses it for self-defense. So I think that's something that we should look at.
I think that there are places, like courthouses and government buildings and schools.
Well, yeah.
And, so I think that to my knowledge, what the governor is trying to do and what we're is trying to regulate where you can carry a gun.
Yeah. So George, whenever we hear about news about you, because I think you are mentioned a lot in national news too, there's always another George name that pops up. That figure is the Democratic powerman George Soros. We were wondering, do you have personal rapport with him, or just what?
Yeah, no, I don't have a personal rapport with him, but I think this is one of those areas where, especially the right-wing conservative. But
you got $5 million your campaign.
May I finish, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
They try to vilify right. We don't talk about the Koch brothers or the people that put a bunch of money on the right. But there is they like to talk about somebody that has put a great deal of money throughout his life for democracy building. So, for instance, he funds democratic governments in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and yes, he has engaged in criminal justice reform, much like you have people on the right that are putting millions and millions of dollars to foster right-wing politics.
Koch brothers you're talking about, right?
That's one example. There are many others. I can tell you right now, for instance, there's a PAC that started to, collect money against me that is being funded by a billionaire from New York who happens to be the same guy that gave George Santos a bunch of money so he could get and run for Congress. So I think that, you have clearly people on the right that do not like how Mr. Soros has invested some of his money. But, the democracy is about people putting their money in political arenas, and the Supreme Court, unfortunately, many years ago, ruled under Citizens United that money was protected by free speech, and that's why you have both the right and the left putting money out there.
So he's a friend of yours you meet
He's
personally?
Not a friend of mine.
Oh, you never met him?
I have met him,
you
but
have
he's not
met
a
him.
friend of mine.
Oh, okay, all right.
Well, you know what? I think it was a great time having you here, Mr. Gascon. Just to sit here and talk to you and hear your thoughts on, and hearing your background. I think it really shed light on a lot of your policies and what your beliefs are. My request is that as the district attorney, that you move forward to make California a much better place, whatever needs to be done, and enact certain tough laws here and there.
Any last words you want to say to our
Well, absolutely. Look, I spent an entire career doing this, right? I've been involved in public safety through policing as a prosecutor. I get up in the morning thinking about how we're going to make our community safer, and I go to bed thinking about how we're going to make our community safer. A lot of the things that we have done in the last 2 years are bringing us back to a more normal period of time. We will continue to do so. LA continues to be a much safer community than many other communities around not only the state, but around the country. But, we have a long way to go. And I look forward to continuing this work. And by the way, I look forward to being invited again.
Okay, all right.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was Mr. George Gascon, District Attorney of joining us on Culture Shock. And that's going to be it for us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.